DEI, an acronym that sits at the center of the current presidential administration's political agenda, seems to be a rather hot topic recently, at least in these weird little political news bubbles we create for ourselves. However, you might know from personal experience that the average person just kind of doesn't know exactly what DEI even means, despite it being such a key central point in the discourse surrounding modern American politics. In fact, even politicians themselves appear to have wildly contrasting assessments regarding what DEI programs are, what functions they seek to perform, and what effects those programs actually have. No, JD, turns out that DEI programs aren't the reason 2 white pilots got ran into by an Army helicopter over the Potomac. Maybe it had to do with poor staffing in FAA control centers caused by, well, I don't know, but I'm sure someone or something caused it. Probably a rogue army of bunnies or something. Maybe they were pissed off by the rapid deregulation of climate initiatives protecting their habitats. Or maybe they just don't like your face, JD. It definitely wasn't DEI initiatives, though. So, in this poor attempt at maintaining a lighthearted demeanor while communicating the dire circumstances we find ourselves in concerning American politics, we're going to talk a bit about diversity, equity, inclusion programs, what they actually are, how they actually affect the businesses and government agencies that implement them, and why the party that claims to be pro-economic growth continues to undermine policies that would increase economic growth and prosperity. I am recording this after all of the tariff bananas went into place, but we're going to talk about that in a different video. This is a political review of the term DEI. Does anyone else remember when, just over a year prior to the release of this video, a giant cargo ship crashed into the Francis Scott Key Bridge just outside of Baltimore? The MV Dolly, part of the Neo-Panamax class of cargo ship, the largest class able to transit the Panama Canal, lost power after its piloting tugboats were released and the ship began its course toward the Atlantic Ocean. While backup generators were initiated, they couldn't supply power to the propulsion system that would have kept the ship on track, causing the Dolly to slowly drift off course toward the supports of the bridge. As soon as the pilots became aware of their collision course, they notified the Maryland Department of Transportation that clearing the bridge of all traffic would be necessary to save lives. While traffic was stopped by the time the Dolly hit the bridge, there were still road workers in their trucks when the bridge collapsed, with 6 of those workers passing away that morning. You might also remember the storm of controversy that arose amongst conservative media pundits once it was found out that one of the multiple Port of Baltimore commissioners, Corinthia Barber, was an advocate for DEI programs and a diversity initiative consultant prior to her appointment to the Port Commission. This controversy also directed itself toward Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott, who was labeled a DEI mayor, despite holding an elected position for which he earned over 70% of the city's votes. Votes from what I'm assuming the right wing refers to as DEI residents of DEI Baltimore. All of this must make you wonder what DEI has to do with a ship losing power and a bridge collapsing as a result. Let me skip the exposition for a second to make it clear. The way that the right wing uses the term DEI today, as you can probably already tell by context, is as some kind of slur. A modern slur, as Garrison Hayes puts it in his fantastic video about the history of these kinds of words, which you should definitely check out. But now that we've done this exposition and acknowledged the elephant in the room, let's actually talk about what DEI programs are. DEI programs can actually have their roots traced back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, and age in all employment settings. However, as we well know, discrimination and prejudice didn't magically disappear once LBJ signed the act into law, nor did it end after the Fair Housing Act in 1968, nor after Brown v. Board implementation sped up in the 1970s and 80s, nor after your great aunt Beatrice posted a black square on Instagram after her virtual Pilates class in 2020. No, what happened instead was the burying of discriminatory practices beneath otherwise innocent concerns. For example, After busing initiatives expanded to allow black students to integrate into traditionally white schools, white families across the country began to argue not that they didn't want black children in their schools, but that their concern is with education. Segregation activists in the North, as the Equal Justice Initiative puts it, distinguished themselves from unsophisticated racist Southerners by focusing on their identities as mothers concerned about school safety, quality, and cohesiveness. This is how discrimination began to imprint itself into the fabric of our modern political discourse. It isn't overt, it isn't flashy, and in fact it holds itself in opposition against more extreme groups like the KKK or Patriot Front, since those groups rob this kind of discrimination of its main power: plausible deniability. It's a lot easier to make a case for resegregating schools if you do it under the guise of genuine concern for the quality of education, which is an argument that doesn't necessarily make sense due to it being repeatedly shown that education outcomes for students in more diverse environments are significantly better than students in less diverse environments. It's almost like it was never about improving education in the first place. DEI programs, like I said earlier, have their roots in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If one acknowledges that the forms of discrimination that the Civil Rights Act intended to outlaw still exist today, which is a claim backed up by multiple thorough studies we'll talk about in a second and which I will link in the description, then one would seek to eliminate those forms of discrimination from within the school or the workplace rather than placing the burden of enforcement on the government. This is what DEI programs seek to do, especially when the government is doing government things, since government things, at least recently, have not been great. Here's a few things that DEI programs are not intended to do. Enforce hiring quotas based on race or gender. Force employers to consider any single employee's race or gender in any employment, promotion, or wage-setting situation. Force employers to hire an unqualified candidate of color over a qualified candidate who is white. Here's a few things that DEI programs are intended to do. Encourage the advertisement of job opportunities to demographics that may not traditionally receive those opportunities. Enforce the consideration of all applications by hiring managers regardless of the applicant's race or gender, or their perceived race or gender based on their name or other identifiable information. And they're intended to restructure divisions within workplaces in order to bring unique perspectives together and subsequently create new ideas for the company or government organization within which the restructuring is taking place. The point of these initiatives is simply to allow folks that have faced various forms of explicit and implicit discrimination throughout their lives to access the same opportunities as folks that have not faced that same discrimination. Let's go back to those studies I mentioned earlier to see what this kind of discrimination looks like in the modern day. One 2019 study from the journal Sociological Science brings together evidence from 97 field studies to determine that white natives in the United States, Germany, and Norway receive 20 to 40% more application callbacks than non-white minorities. In France and Sweden, this number is between 65 and 100%. Those values show significant discrimination against non-white minority groups, and while white immigrants did also face some discrimination, it was not statistically significant. An additional 2020 article in the journal Social Forces showed that while white majority applicants received an average of 53% more callbacks than comparable minority applicants in close to 100 field studies, majority applicants received 145% more job offers than those same minority applicants. Since we can see that discrimination still clearly exists in the hiring process amongst multiple Western countries and probably across the world, although there is an absence of data available to argue one way or the other, the main question we need to ask is if discrimination has decreased over time as civil rights laws have been enacted and implemented across government agencies. And based on my tone, you can probably guess that this hiring discrimination has not decreased over time, at least not since the 1970s. This is shown in a 2023 study that measured trends across field studies to find that out of 6 Western countries, including the United States, in only one did hiring discrimination decrease over the past few decades, and that was France. In the rest, it either remained persistent or slightly increased, showing that civil rights laws and other cultural initiatives have not helped combat deep-seated discriminatory tendencies amongst Western populations. And while DEI initiatives only represent a single method for addressing these tendencies, they've been shown to be broadly effective for not only reducing discriminatory hiring practices within the companies that implement them, but also for increasing performance and growth for those companies. Goldman Sachs found that companies with diverse boards significantly outperformed those with homogeneous boards in their IPOs, and they subsequently implemented a policy stating that they would only take companies public if they had a diverse board. This policy was only withdrawn in 2025 in response to the current presidential administration's anti-DEI executive orders. A 2023 McKinsey & Company study found that companies with representation of women exceeding 30% were significantly more likely to financially outperform those with 30% or lower. And companies in their top quartile for ethnic diversity show an average 27% financial advantage over others. The positive correlation between both gender and ethnic diversity on boards of directors and financial performance was also statistically significant in their report. And now that we've slogged through all those numbers, it should be pretty obvious why DEI initiatives exist. It's not to discriminate against white people, and it isn't to enforce hiring quotas. They're just intended to give opportunities to folks who are qualified candidates that have lacked or continue to lack equal access to those opportunities, regardless of those folks' specific gender or race. And when companies do implement these policies, they more often than not see significant benefits over companies that do not, showing that diversity in the workplace should be a positive thing for everyone, even people that are fiscally conservative who vote for right-wing candidates because they believe they're better for the economy. Diversity is better for the economy. Why then does the current administration continue to lobby against diversity initiatives while simultaneously claiming that their policies are good for economic growth? Well, the arguments they make about DEI practices disadvantaging and discriminating against white men specifically should be a clue, especially since DEI programs, again, do not remove opportunities for white candidates or refuse to hire them based on quotas. In fact, a 2023 study shows that in the battle between qualified and underqualified candidates in the hiring process, underqualified candidates with names perceived as white are more likely to be hired than qualified candidates with names perceived as black. There is no good data showing that white men are discriminated against by these initiatives point blank, and thus there is no logical reason for one to argue against their existence, unless, of course, that person wishes to cement discriminatory practices into law rather than uproot them, or to advocate for the superiority of white men over women and people of color. And that provides our reasoning for why the term DEI has entangled itself into the current political lexicon. It's for the same reason that critical race theory was demonized a few years ago, or the term woke, or the Me Too movement. Each of these terms has represented an effort by marginalized groups to make progress toward a more equal future, and each of those terms were crafted into modern slurs by the right in order to destabilize the playing field once again, even if they are also movements that would broadly increase economic prosperity and growth if their advocated policies were to be implemented. The smartest way to combat the use of these terms as modern slurs is to only use them ourselves when we are referring to the exact meaning of that term, since the chaos that is created when these movements are given alternate meanings is also the fog of war in which these movements are destroyed. I hope this video provided a bit of clarity regarding DEI initiatives, what they are, why they exist, and why they've become a catch-all term for the current administration's rapid rollback of civil rights protections. Because that's it for this video. Stay tuned for next week, where I actually post a video on schedule for once and follow up on my promise to talk about why Americans love cars so much, why Tesla is likely doomed to fail, and why China and Mexico are getting buddy-buddy with car production deals. Here's a big hint, it's not because of the bunny attacks, I think.